everybody, Chris here. Welcome back to another episode of Woodmere Estate Revival. Today, we are making final preparations to paint our fireplace surround and our office built-in. We're super excited to get this thing painted out. Yesterday, I spent some time trimming up all the woodwork, anything that needed a little bit of an adjustment as far as the crown. And then we got all of the wood putty and everything in all the nail holes and screw holes. Got all that ready. Today, I'm using the sanding, our random orbit sander, and progressively finer grit sandpaper to sand down the edges and make sure everything's perfectly smooth and ready for our first coat of paint. We're gonna have to do a little bit of hand preparation as well around the panels before we're ready for primer. So let me show you exactly what we're doing today, and we're gonna get back to work. All right, so here's how it sits right now. I've already been working on this side over here. And you can see some of the wood puttied holes here. But what I did is I started out with 40 grit and went up and down the entire corner where these two panels meet. These panels were all made separately outside, and then we brought them inside and we joined them together. So I wanted to make sure that this was perfectly smooth, as if it was just made out of, one piece of wood. So we started out with 40 grit just to knock down the edge, and then went up to 80 grit. And then now finally 180 grit, got a good smooth finish in preparation for our primer. So anywhere there was a screw hole, we put a little wood putty. Some of these didn't quite fill, so we're gonna have to touch those up probably after we prime, hit them with a little fast and final or something. This corner over here I've already gotten done. Same thing, took the 40 grit and then the 80 and the 180 and went all the way up and down both corners here. And this panel's nice and smooth and ready to go. What do you think, hon? Looking good?
It is. You did good work.
Thank you, thank you. Still got to do the wood putty on the crown. But yesterday, like I said, I dressed up any of the corners where something was sticking out proud a little bit. Had to do a little sanding and a little bit of final fit and finish work on a couple of these corners. And then dressed them up with a little wood putty as well, just so everything's perfectly smooth and the corners meet nicely. Here's what it looks like before start sanding. This stuff does shrink just a little bit, so I end up leaving it a little bit proud so that when it shrinks, it hopefully ends up flush with the surface. It doesn't take long at all once you start hitting the stuff with the random orbit sander to get it knocked down flush. So both of these corners, I just finished with the 40 grit, and you can see how rough it leaves it. It's a pretty rough texture there, so that's again why we go progressively finer, 80 and then 180, and that leaves it nice and smooth and ready. This side still needs done. So I'm gonna get set back up here and go ahead. I just finished with the 40, so I'm gonna switch paper and then go ahead and hit this entire panel on both corners and the whole, the middle as well with the 80 grit next. All right, we got sandpaper on. This is the 80 grit. And I'm using my shop vac on the back of this thing instead of the dust collector bag. One of these days I'm going to break down and actually get a fitting that hooks these two together so I don't have to do it by hand, but hey, this works pretty good in the meantime. All right, so I finished with the 80 grit and then switched over to the 180. Got everything smoothed down very nicely. You can see now there's none of that fuzz on there that was left over from the 80 or the 40 grit. Still gonna go through one more time by hand and hit it with the sanding sponge. I've got like a 220 grit sanding sponge. So I'm gonna hit all these little details, make sure there's no rough spots here. Some of the stuff I'm sure will show up once we prime it, and then we can go back through and touch up. We got some tiny little cracks here, for instance, that little gap. I'll probably hit that with a little fast and final spackle right before we paint, or a little caulk, just to seal that up. But overall, it looks really good. This poplar takes a nice finish. So once we get everything perfect and ready to go and primed, I think we'll be able to get it covered up with our trim paint. It's gonna look gorgeous. One little trick is if you're gonna be sanding near surfaces like hardwood floors or marble, you can take a drywall knife and put that right at the bottom of your material, even tuck it under the edge if you've got room, and then you can sand right down to it, and the edge of your random orbit sander won't tear up the floor. You can see how the paper kind of folds over and scuffs the surface there. Well, if I didn't have that knife there, sanding all the way down to the floor would be impossible without sanding the floor itself, and that would not be good. So, little tip. Now we're ready to go ahead and do a little bit of handwork, and then I've got to go around the top here and sand off any wood putty around the top with all the little nail holes and screw holes that I filled there. Got to do underneath the mantle here. Once we get everything sanded down, vacuumed, wiped down, we'll be ready for caulk, and then we'll go ahead and get it primed. I think this thing is gonna really pop once we get the primer on there. And then a couple of coats of good oil-based trim color, and it's really gonna look amazing. So I just finished taking a sanding sponge to everything. We've got several different grits on the sanding sponges. I believe this is like a 100 grit, I think. And then this is like a 180 or a 200 grit. So anyways, I wanted to make sure that these end grains were smooth. That's the hardest part. When you put these through the router, this end grain tends to kind of chip out, whereas when you're going with the grain, it tends to go out really smooth. So this takes some extra time and attention to get this smooth. So you really gotta work it and use your hands. You can't really look at it and tell if it needs more work. You really just gotta feel it and make sure that it's perfectly smooth, because it'll show like crazy once we get some paint on it. I did find one area that I needed to tighten up a little bit. This panel wasn't quite as tight against this one as I wanted, so I went ahead and put a screw there and put a little wood putty on that. But other than that, everything is in good shape, sanded down, ready to go. Amber's gonna get a coat of primer on it tomorrow. And once we get it primed, we'll find any little defects that we need to go back and fill in. We can take a little caulk or a little wood filler, something just to make sure there's no little tiny cracks. Something like this, it may not look like much now, but you get some paint on it, you're like, ooh, I hate that. So we may end up taking a little bit of lightweight filler and filling that. And then some of this wood filler shrunk a little bit. So that'll show up, once we put the primer on there. So we'll probably go back and, go across the whole thing again, look for any little defects in the wood, and then we'll go back through and kind of sand everything, probably take some 220 grit to the primer, knock down any high spots or any rough spots. And then once that's done, we'll be able to go up and sand down all the crown, and then we'll caulk and go ahead and put a coat of our trim paint on the whole thing. It's gonna look fantastic. So we'll keep you guys posted as the paint goes on. So as you can see, Amber did an amazing job getting the fireplace surround primed. So all that poplar covered up with a nice coat of white primer. It's kind of sad covering up that wood after we'd worked so hard on it, but it's gonna look gorgeous painted out in our trim color. So this is primer. Tonight we sanded down everything. Make sure there was no roughness or any sort of raised grain. So we got everything sanded down and it looks really, really good. And then up top here, we sanded down all the wood filler that was on the nail holes, screw holes, anything that we had to touch up on any of the corners, anything like that. And once we did that, we blew it down with the air hose and then we caulked everything. So in between the crown and the ceiling, and the crown and the dental and the starter mold, all that got caulked. And then in between the crown and the ceiling and the crown and the raised panels got caulked as well. So we're looking really good. Can't wait to see it got all painted out. Amber's going to start on that tomorrow. Her dad's actually going to be in town and is going to give her a hand getting all this painted out. So super excited to see it in color tomorrow evening once they've got everything coated with the first coat. And another day we'll have this thing got 2 coats on it, and it's going to be gorgeous. Then we'll get to hang our TV up and finally start to finish this space. So we'll keep you guys posted.